In this video, we'll look at the evolution of the narrative voice or the narrative traditions over the ages. We'll start from the Middle Ages and we'll proceed to the 18th, 19th century, 20th century, and we'll take a look at what the narrative voice looks like in today's day and age. So we'll start from the Middle Ages. Now, as we all know, the culture of the Middle Ages was very eclectic. Now, what do you mean by this? The culture of the Middle Ages was influenced by a number of sources, a wide range of sources. That is why it is called eclectic. And therefore, the narrative developments that happened during this time extended to the understanding of the poet's voice as well. People started to look at the poet's voice in a very analytic manner. Now, in this particular period, certain narrative traditions, certain ancient narrative traditions were preserved, certain others were destroyed. Because Middle Ages, as we all know, there were a number of wars, there were a number of conflicts that happened during this time. Therefore, a number of narrative traditions were completely destroyed, were completely wiped away, and certain others, because of the work done by the church uh, and by individual monasteries, certain narrative traditions were preserved. You might remember that the Middle Ages was a period of invasions and conflicts, Viking invasions, Nordic invasions. So, a number of traditions were completely eradicated. Some others were preserved during this time. Anyway, the main literary figures who made remarkable contributions during this time were Chaucer, Boccaccio, and Rabelais. Uh, Now, Geoffrey Charlser, the father of English literature, Boccaccio, the great Italian poet, the author of Decameron, and Rabelais was a French poet whose most famous work is Gargantia. This is spelling mistake here. Gargantia and Pantagruel. These were the main literary figures of the Middle Ages, uh, hailing from different parts of Europe. Chaucer from England, Boccaccio from Italy, and Rabelais from France. Now, Chaucer and Boccaccio, as we had already studied in history of English literature, shared certain common features. In that, especially could be seen in their works. Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's The Decameron. Chaucer was inspired by the Decameron and wrote uh, the Canterbury Tales. Both follow a frame narrative in that there's a story within a story. Uh, but at the end of it, you'll find that both Chaucer and Boccaccio's opinions also come into the forefront. They comment on the characters, they comment on the social conditions. Uh, their opinions or their voice also uh, is very important in their works. Not just the voice of the characters. No, you'll find that Chaucer and Boccaccio often make commentary on the characters and the situations and the social milieu. Rabelais, on the other hand, stands out from these other two contemporaries of his, in that he separated the author's voice from the voice of the characters. Okay, he believed in keeping the two separate. That is, his opinions were never uh, interfering or were never included in his works. The character's voice was kept separate, and that of the author was kept separate, which was very different practice from that of Chaucer or book at you. Now, this speaking of these voices, the voice of the author, the voice of the narrator, the voice of the characters. Now, the author might not always be the narrator of a particular story, right? The author can keep himself distant from the story. There might there might be a person called the narrator who is telling the story, whose persona will be different from that of the real author. In some cases, the author himself plays the role of the narrator, in the sense that his personal opinions or his opinions play a role. That is why in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, the narrator is Chaucer himself. Yes, he is a part of the story. He is considered as one of the pilgrims. He observes all the other pilgrims. Uh, he makes comments on these pilgrims and the journey and the social conditions. Uh, so in that particular work, Chaucer is the author, and he is also the narrator of the Canterbury Tales. But there are certain other works where the narrator's persona is completely different from that of the author. Uh, in that respect, we have to take into account the uh, terms introduced by the famous Russian linguist and literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. Now, Mikhail Bakhtin introduced a particular term called polyphony. Polyphony means poly means multiple, phony means voice. Polyphony means multiple voiced effect. Now, what does this mean? In a particular work, there might be a number of characters, and these characters might have different opinions. A particular event can be analyzed by different characters in different ways, right? The way the hero thinks about a particular event will be completely different from the way the heroine thinks about it. It will be completely different from the way uh, the villain thinks about a particular event. So there are multiple voices within a literary work or within a narrative. Here we are not restricting ourselves to literary works alone. We can talk about all kinds of narratives. So a particular narrative can have many voices within it. That is, each character's take on different events will be different. The hero will be thinking about a particular event in a different way. The villain will be thinking about the same event in another way. The other sub characters would be thinking about the same event in another way. So each of them have a different voice, and the author or the narrator's take on the same event will be completely different. So that is why multiple voices are there in a narrative, polyphony. And that leads to heteroglossia. Now, you might remember the term heteroglossia from linguistics. Now, remember, Mikhail Bakhtin was a linguist as well. Um, what do you mean by heteroglossia in linguistics? The existence of different varieties of the same language uh, is referred to as heteroglossia. You might remember that in certain places of the world, a single language has a high variety and a low variety. Yes, in formal occasions, the high variety might be used. At home, the low variety or the common variety might be used. In writing literary works, the high variety, like Arabic or like Greek, has a higher variety that is used for writing literary works. The lower variety is used for everyday usage. As far as linguistics is concerned, that is the meaning of heteroglossia. Uh, as well as narratives are concerned, uh, it is uh, a kind of conflict that arises because of the presence of these multiple voices. And this conflict uh, this conflict leads to the success of a work as well. That is, the because of the presence of multiple voices, there are conflicting opinions, there are different opinions, and that exactly leads to the success of a particular work. Uh, so Bakhtin believed that heteroglossia and polyphony can be seen mainly in novels. Um, More than any other narrative, more than any other literary work, uh, these two phenomena can be found mainly in novels. Now, what do you mean by heteroglossia? There exists number of voices, multiple voices exist, and because of that, conflicts might arise, and that itself leads to the success of a particular literary work. Now, I've given you the definition that was provided by Bakhtin himself about heteroglossia, another speech in another's language serving to express authorial intentions but in a refracted way. So, the same event can have multiple definitions, but to it serves to express the author's intentions, but in different ways. That is heteroglossia. That could lead to conflicts, like each character might have different opinions, and even the reader's opinion might be very different from that of the characters. That is heteroglossia. Now, these differing opinions lead the reader to think differently about a particular event, right? And that leads to the success of a novel. It makes the reader think. Yes. So remember these two terms, polyphony and heteroglossia, introduced by uh, Mikhail Bakhtin. Mikhail Bakhtin. Now we can move on to uh, two different literary genres, the romance and the novel. Now, the romance was very popular during the Middle Ages. Uh, as far as English is concerned, the most famous romance was Morte d'Arthur, written by Mallory, which led with the Arthurian legend, the legend of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. Uh, you also have Philip Sidney's Arcadia. As far as another other languages are concerned, you have in Spanish Don Quixote, very famous, very popular romance. Now, what is the main essence of a romance? It is chivalry. It is bravery, loyalty, honor. These are the core factors of romance. And romances became popular during the Middle Ages because of the founding of the printing press, the introduction of the printing press. William Caxton was the one who introduced printing press into England, and as a result of which, a number of romances were published, and that led to the popularity of the romances during the Middle Ages. And another reason for the popularity of the romance was that it was published in the vernacular languages. That is, the language that was used by the common people. So people could read these works easily. Now, coming to the origin of the novel, there are a number of factors that led to the origin and popularity of the novel. Uh, First is that literacy rate increased during the 18th century, and more people could read and write. The prosperity of the middle class led to the popularity of the novel. The social conditions, basically, the coffee house culture, the popularity of journalism, the popularity of journals. Remember, most of these novels were not published in book forms initially, they were published as episodes in various journals. Uh, so, all these factors, the political awareness of the working classes, all this led to the popularity of the novel, and this popularity still survives. That is one major aspect about the novel. Now, when you are talking about the novel, remember to mention the points mentioned by Mikhail Bakhtin. Now, Bakhtin says that the novel is an interesting form of narrative because it is heteroglossic. The novels are made up of many different voices, some of which may be competing, and that's what makes uh, novels interesting, according to Bakhtin. Now, staying with novels, Ian Foster, the very famous British novelist, made an attempt to reduce literary narrative to basic principles of narratology. Now, what he did was he tried to distinguish between a story and a plot in his famous critical work, Aspects of the Novel. So, remember the title of the work, Aspects of the Novel, published in the year 1927. In this work, he tried to distinguish between a story and a plot. Now, the example that he gave was the example that I gave you in one of the previous classes. Now, what was this distinction that he made? The example that he gave to make this distinction. The king died, and then the queen died. The king died and then the queen died is a story. That is, one event happened and another event followed. That is a story. Now, take a look at the next example. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a lot. You are offering an additional explanatory clause. That is, it is because of the death of the king that the queen died. You are giving an explanation for the queen's death. So that makes it a plot. Now, this is the example that was given by Ian Foster in his famous work, Aspects of the Novel. So the king died, and then the queen died is basically arrangement of events, in the chronological order. The king died first, the queen died second. That is a story. Plot, on the other hand, gives you explanations, gives you reasons. Uh, the king died and then the queen died of grief. That is the reason. The king's death caused grief, and that grief led to the death of the queen. That is a plot because you are giving an explanation. Now, coming to the post 1970s. In the 1970s, what happened to the novel? Novelists began to experiment with new ways of representing reality. The novelists had two functions. One, to describe the action and the characters in the novel as real, and the second function of the novelist uh, uh, were to prove that the novel is still fiction. Now, in the 1970s, the effort that was made by the novelist was to portray very real events. Okay, the characters, the events that found place in most of these novels appear very, very real. So that was the function, the first function of the novelist in the 1970s. That is to describe the action and the characters in the novel as real. It's almost as if when you read these novels, you feel almost as if you know these characters, you know these situations are very, very much possible in a daily life, in real life. So that was the one function, that was the first function of the novelist, to narrate the events and the characters in such a way that they would appear very real to the readers. The second function is the complete opposite to that. It's very contradictory to that. The second function of the novelist was to prove that the novel is still fiction. See, you are portraying the characters and the events as very real, but the readers must also realize that that particular literary work is a work of fiction. The characters within that literary work are very real, might appear very real, but the literary work as a whole is still fiction. Uh, to make the readers realize that fact was another function of the novelist, and that is a feature of postmodernist literary works. The postmodern era, another development was that grand narratives were no longer considered as grand. Now, this was a point made by the French critic Jean-Francois Lyotard. Lyotard, just remember his name, Lyotard. Uh, he believed that grand narratives are not grand any longer. Now, what do you mean by grand narratives or meta narratives? They are also known as meta narratives. Let me add it here. Grand narratives or meta narratives. Now, Lyotard was of the belief that um, history was related to us, or history was described to us in the form of grand narratives. There were certain big events, or there were certain big ideologies that changed the course of history. For example, enlightenment was a big event that led to the development of certain other events. Okay, so enlightenment is a grand narrative. Renaissance is a grand narrative. It's because of the it's when you learn about Western history, or when you learn about British history, you study that it's because of Renaissance that certain that many events during the 15th and the 16th centuries happened. So Renaissance is a grand narrative. Then when you come to the 19th century, you the grand narratives are democracy. The rise of democracy is another major grand narrative. It's because of the rise of democracy that many major events happened. Then another grand narrative in the 19th century would be Marxism. So these are grand narratives. So Lyotard was of the opinion that most of history was written from the point of grand narratives. There was this major event, or this major phenomenon, or major ideology, and because of this major ideology, other events happened, or the course of history was shaped by this major event or ideology. Um, but that's what happened in the past. But in the postmodern era, these grand narratives are null and void. They are irrelevant. Instead, the focus is on smaller events, localized events. What happens in the uh, uh, smaller regions, in our neighborhoods, in our localities. The small events, those are significant in the postmodern era, according to Lyotard. um, earlier what was happening in the global scale, grand, meta, right, was more important. For example, Marxism developed in Europe, but that influenced the entire world. So that is a grand narrative. Lyotard believes that in the postmodern era, such events are irrelevant. Such grand or meta narratives are irrelevant. You should focus more on what is happening in our vicinity, in our neighborhoods. Another French critic, uh, Baudrillard, he was of the belief that technologies reproduce science, especially narrative science. So, technology also plays a part in narration, or it plays a part in narrative techniques. Now, what Baudrillard said holds true when we look at the development of the radio, television, and internet. What do? They offer us new forms of narration. Earlier, we were only used to hearing narratives. We were only used to reading narratives. But radio provided us with a new platform. There also in radio also you hear certain things, right? But with the use of technology, television offers us visual narration, right? With the advent of television, what happened? The filmmakers or the narrators were forced to use the visual platform or the visual media to give us different forms of narration. It's a visual narration that is provided by the television. And internet, of course, the possibilities are uh, huge. We have not yet explored all the possibilities that are offered by the internet. We are only familiar with a few, right? Internet offers us new forms of narration as well. That is why we have blogs, we have uh, online platforms, uh, uh, we have mm, um, e-readers, right? Nowadays you can read e-books, you can listen to audiobooks, you can watch web series, you can watch movies on the internet. All these are different forms of narration. Narration is what is happening, but these are the narratives are presented to us in various other forms. So internet, remember the term, as when you're talking about internet, remember the term cyberspace. You already know what cyberspace is. uh, um, the platform provided by the internet, and the possibilities offered are huge, humongous. So remember these things when you're talking about uh, narrative voices. Thank you.